Welcome back to the channel. Today, we drift deep into one of history's greatest mysteries, the rise and fall of the legendary Atlantis. Was it real? Was it a warning? Or was it something far more mysterious? Stay with us as we uncover the clues and unravel the truth hidden beneath the waves. If you enjoy history, lost civilizations, and untold stories, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell icon because we have many more fascinating journeys coming your way. Now, let's begin. Imagine a city that seemed to rise out of the sea like a dream, where sunlight glimmered across marble temples and where canals cut gracefully through the land like silver veins. Picture towers climbing toward the sky, decorated with copper and gold. Picture streets alive with merchants, philosophers, sailors, and craftsmen, all moving through a world that felt far more advanced than anything around it. This place had fleets of powerful ships, armies unlike any others, and knowledge that seemed almost magical compared to neighboring civilizations. Its leaders believed they had been blessed by the gods. Its people grew confident, some would say overconfident, in their greatness. And then, suddenly, in what seemed like a single terrible night, the earth trembled, the sea surged, and this extraordinary civilization was swallowed by the waves, leaving nothing behind but fragments of memory and legend. This is the story of Atlantis, a name that still echoes across centuries, whispered in books, documentaries, and endless debates. For more than 2,000 years, the world has been captivated by the question, what actually happened to this mysterious place? Was Atlantis real, or was it merely a brilliant story crafted as a warning? Was it a lost civilization erased by nature, or an illusion kept alive because we want to believe that humanity once achieved something far beyond our imagination? The legend begins long before modern explorers, satellites, or science. Long before submarine cameras searched the ocean floor. Long before treasure hunters dreamed of ancient cities beneath the waves. The tale begins in the minds of storytellers who spoke of a mighty empire that existed thousands of years earlier. They described a rich and powerful island beyond the horizon, where people lived in harmony with nature, guided by wise kings until ambition began to rot their greatness from within. From the very first time Atlantis was mentioned, people were hooked. There was something irresistible about it, a perfect blend of mystery, danger, and lost glory. Humans have always been drawn to stories of things that vanish, ships disappearing at sea, kingdoms collapsing overnight, cities buried under ash, treasures hidden forever beneath sand. But Atlantis wasn't just any lost city. It was described as being spectacular, perhaps even more advanced than the civilizations that came after it. The idea that an entire society more powerful and more intelligent than anything around it could just disappear struck a deep chord. Part of the fascination lies in the fact that Atlantis represents both our highest hopes and our greatest fears. On one hand, it suggests that humanity once achieved greatness beyond our current understanding, that perhaps somewhere in the distant past, people discovered technologies, philosophies, or systems of life that were lost to time. On the other hand, it reminds us that no matter how powerful a civilization becomes, it can crumble in an instant. The earth can shake, the sea can rise. A single catastrophic event can erase centuries of progress as if they never existed. As explorers sailed across the world centuries later, many of them wondered whether they might find proof of Atlantis. When the Americas were discovered by Europeans, some believed they had finally found the lost continent mentioned in legends. When ancient ruins were uncovered in different corners of the world, from the pyramids to mysterious stone structures, people wondered whether they were somehow connected to Atlantis. Each discovery fueled imagination rather than solving the mystery. Yet what makes Atlantis truly different from other myths? is that its story didn't come from random rumors or folk tales. It came from one of the most famous thinkers in human history, the Greek philosopher Plato. And that changed everything. When most myths originate from anonymous storytellers, scholars tend to dismiss them as fantasy. But when a story comes from a philosopher known for shaping Western thought, people pay attention. Plato was not a novelist, he was a teacher, a political thinker, and a deep observer of human behavior, so when he described Atlantis, some readers assumed he must have based it on real information. Others believed he crafted it deliberately as a moral lesson. In Plato's telling, Atlantis was not simply rich, it was mighty. It possessed great fleets and armies, stretching its power across the sea, influencing neighboring lands. Its kings descended, according to the legend, from Poseidon, the god of the sea. They built magnificent cities arranged in perfect circles, a striking symbol of order and control. They cultivated vast fields, controlled waterways, and used natural resources intelligently. Life in Atlantis seemed carefully designed, as though guided by reason and structure rather than chaos. It sounds almost like an ideal society, and perhaps that was part of the point. Plato describes how, over time, the Atlanteans drifted away from virtue, prosperity gave birth to greed, power turned to arrogance. Conquest replaced wisdom. Where once they lived with balance, they began to crave domination. Instead of respecting limits, they pushed further, seeking to rule everything beyond their borders. According to the narrative, the gods took notice of this decline. What had once been a noble civilization had become morally corrupt. It was no longer the society it had been meant to be. So, the legend says, the gods allowed nature itself to turn against Atlantis. Suddenly, the island was struck by earthquakes and floods, the ground opened, buildings collapsed, the great harbors and canals were overwhelmed, thunderous waves crashed across the land, and in a single, catastrophic encounter with the forces of the earth, Atlantis vanished beneath the ocean. Imagine what that must have looked like in the minds of ancient listeners, a grand and shining world disappearing into darkness, swallowed by the sea forever, no survivors to rebuild, no ruins left on the surface. Only water, silence, and mystery, but here's where curiosity begins to grow. People naturally want to ask, if Atlantis truly existed, where did it go? Civilizations like Rome or Babylon left ruins, artifacts, writings, monuments. But Atlantis supposedly left nothing we can clearly identify today. Was it because it never existed, or because its remains lie somewhere unreachable, hidden deep beneath miles of sediment and stone? For centuries, philosophers, historians, adventurers, and conspiracy theorists have all tried to answer that question. Some have claimed that Atlantis lies in the deep Atlantic Ocean, exactly where one might expect based on its name. Others argue that it once stood where now there is nothing but desert. Still others point toward volcanic islands destroyed in ancient explosions. And while modern science tends to reject the more dramatic interpretations, even scientists admit that the ocean floor is one of the least explored regions on Earth. Vast territories beneath the waves remain unmapped or unexamined. Who knows what lies there, yet the obsession with Atlantis isn't just about archaeology or geology, it's also psychological. Humans are storytellers. We imagine lost worlds because they allow us to reflect on ourselves. Atlantis invites us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when a society becomes too powerful, too proud, too convinced of its own invincibility? Could something similar happen to us? Could our greatest achievements also contain the seeds of our destruction? The legend acts almost like a cautionary mirror. It says, yes, civilization can be glorious, but it can also collapse when it forgets humility, balance, or moral responsibility. Whether Atlantis was real or symbolic, the message still hits hard. No empire is immune to downfall. No society is exempt from the consequences of its own behavior. At the same time, the idea of Atlantis sparks our imagination about human potential. What if ancient civilizations were more advanced than we think? What if knowledge has been discovered, lost, rediscovered, and lost again? Could humanity be repeating cycles rather than progressing in one straight line? Atlantis suggests a world where amazing innovation existed and then vanished, leaving future generations to start from scratch. Writers, filmmakers, and theorists continue to build upon this idea. Some portray Atlantis as a utopia destroyed unfairly. Others see it as a corrupt empire punished justly. Still others imagine it as a technologically superior society that made catastrophic mistakes. Each version reveals something about the era in which it is told. During times of war, Atlantis becomes a warning about militarism. During times of environmental concern, it becomes a story about nature striking back after human abuse. During times of technological advancement, it becomes a symbol of scientific power used carelessly, and still, the core mystery remains the same, a powerful civilization erased in one night. Think about how fragile even modern infrastructure can be when natural disasters strike. Earthquakes can destroy cities. Tsunamis can wipe out coastlines. Volcanic eruptions can bury entire regions under ash and rock. We have seen whole communities lost in hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. So is it truly impossible that an advanced island society might have been devastated and largely forgotten over thousands of years? One major catastrophe, combined with the slow erosion of time and the sea, could indeed leave little trace. When you imagine Atlantis, you might picture ruins at the bottom of the ocean, columns broken, statues tilted, walls covered in coral and algae. But if such a place ever existed, the truth might look very different. Over millennia, ocean currents, sediment, and tectonic shifts could bury remains deeper than we can easily reach. If the island fractured or sank into geological cracks, recognizable structures might no longer be intact. That is where the legend gains strength, in the gap between what we know and what we cannot yet prove. For the people of the ancient world, stories like Atlantis served as both entertainment and instruction. They blended myth, history, philosophy, and warning into one compelling tale. Listeners would leave not only curious, but thoughtful. They were encouraged to reflect on their own societies. Are we becoming like Atlantis? Are we forgetting our values? Are we chasing wealth and conquest at the expense of wisdom? To us today, Atlantis may feel more like a puzzle than a parable. We want answers, maps, scientific confirmation. But sometimes legends endure precisely because they refuse to give simple solutions. They challenge us to think, to imagine, to question, and so, every few years, someone claims once again that they have solved the mystery. A new documentary suggests that satellite images reveal an underwater structure. A researcher argues that a desert depression was once filled with water and resembles Plato's description. An adventurer dives into the ocean, convinced that strange rock formations are remnants of lost architecture. Most of these claims eventually fade, yet the idea of Atlantis does not. It keeps resurfacing, refusing to sink, just like the mythic city itself. Perhaps what truly keeps Atlantis alive is not whether it existed in physical reality, but what it represents inside our minds, a rise and fall that feels eerily human, a tale where brilliance and downfall are intertwined, a story that says, greatness can vanish and mysteries can endure forever. Before we analyze whether there is scientific truth behind the legend, it is worth pausing to appreciate how deeply Atlantis has shaped imagination across the world. It has influenced explorers, writers, historians, and dreamers. It has inspired endless theories, debates, and journeys. It stands alone as one of the most persistent stories humanity has ever told, neither fully believable nor entirely dismissible. And so, when we ask what actually happened to Atlantis, we are not just asking about a lost island, we are asking whether civilizations truly rise and disappear without a trace. We are asking whether myth can hide fragments of truth. We are asking whether history is more complicated, more mysterious, and more fragile than we often think. Atlantis, in the end, is not only a place. It is a question, one that echoes across oceans and centuries, urging us to explore, to search, and to wonder what might lie hidden beneath both water and time. When people talk about Atlantis, the conversation almost always returns to one man, Plato. Not explorers, not archaeologists, not sailors or mystics, a philosopher. That fact alone makes the legend unique. Unlike most myths, which grow slowly out of folk tales and superstition, Atlantis appears in history through a deliberate act of storytelling by one of the most influential thinkers ever to live. Understanding what Plato wrote and why he might have written it is the key to understanding the entire mystery. Plato lived in ancient Greece during the 4th century BC, a time when Athens was still struggling with the memory of war, political upheaval, and the rise and fall of empires. He was deeply concerned about human nature, government, morality, and the fate of civilizations. He did not simply write history, he wrote philosophical dialogues, using characters to explore ideas and examine human behavior. In 2 of those dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he introduces Atlantis almost casually, as if it were simply part of the conversation. According to Plato, the story of Atlantis originally came to Greece through the lawgiver Solon, one of Athens' most respected early leaders. Solon traveled to Egypt, where, so the narrative goes, priests from the city of Sais told him an account preserved in their ancient records. They described a powerful island nation that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, far older than any Greek civilization. This island lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, known today as the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the open Atlantic. Beyond that point, they said, was a great land, and in front of it, an island called Atlantis. The Egyptian priests described Atlantis as vast and wealthy, possessing fertile plains, dense forests, and abundant natural resources. Its people were skilled builders, engineers, farmers, and warriors. They were organized, structured, disciplined. Atlantis, in the story, did not begin as a corrupt empire. Instead, it was founded by Poseidon, the god of the sea, who divided the island among his 10 sons. Over generations, the descendants of these rulers governed in relative harmony, guided by a sense of order and justice. Plato paints a picture of a civilization built on principles, not chaos. The capital city, as he describes it, was particularly striking. It was arranged in concentric rings, alternating channels of water and land protected by walls and guarded by gates. Canals stretched outward, connecting the city to the sea, allowing enormous fleets to move easily in and out. Bridges spanned the waterways. Towers and temples rose above everything else, including a massive temple dedicated to Poseidon himself. The Atlanteans excavated the land, domesticated animals, cultivated vast fields, and mined precious metals. They possessed orichalcum, a mysterious substance said to glow like fire, considered second only to gold in value. Plato's description was incredibly detailed, almost architectural, as though he wanted listeners to visualize every aspect. Whether because he had some source or because he was constructing a deliberate image, the effect was powerful. Readers were left imagining a place both fantastical and strangely believable, ordered, engineered, logical. Atlantis did not look like mythology. It looked like urban planning thousands of years ahead of its time, but nestled within this grandeur was the central theme Plato cared about: the relationship between moral character and political power. According to the narrative, the early Atlanteans lived simply and virtuously. They valued wisdom more than wealth, self-control more than greed. Their greatness came from their discipline, yet as their power grew, something inside them changed. They began to love material wealth, luxury, and domination. The balance they once maintained slowly eroded. Where they had once lived in harmony with the world, they began to believe they deserved to rule it. In Plato's telling, this inner corruption eventually expressed itself outward. Atlantis launched aggressive military campaigns, seeking to conquer lands across the Mediterranean. They attacked Egypt. They attacked Greece. They believed their superior strength made them rightful masters. But this expansion brought them into conflict with Athens, and here the story reveals another layer. Plato describes Athens as the noble, virtuous city that stood against the arrogant empire. In many ways, he uses the Atlantis tale to praise Greek values, especially those of a disciplined and just society. The Atlanteans, once divine in spirit, had become like ordinary humans, vulnerable to arrogance, temptation, and moral decay. And the gods, Plato writes, saw this transformation clearly. What followed was not merely war, it was judgment. The island was struck by cataclysmic earthquakes and floods. The sea rose violently. In a single devastating event, Atlantis sank beneath the water and disappeared. At first glance, this sounds like a mythic warning, the proud brought low by divine wrath. But for many centuries, readers have wondered whether Plato truly meant the story as fiction. Plato himself presents the narrative as something reported, something remembered, something recorded in Egyptian temples. He does not introduce it with phrases like "once upon a time." Instead, he frames it as if it were authentic tradition, preserved by priests and passed down through wise men. This framing is what draws historians and treasure hunters alike toward the legend. Yet we have to remember something important about how Plato wrote. His dialogues often used layers of storytelling to convey philosophical meaning. He would create characters, give them arguments, and build scenarios not because those events literally happened, but because they allowed him to explore truths about human society. For Plato, a story could be fictional and still reveal something deeply real. This is why scholars debate Atlantis so intensely. Some argue that Plato invented every detail to illustrate philosophical lessons, particularly about ideal societies, corruption, and divine justice. They say Atlantis represents what happens when a civilization loses its moral compass. Others believe Plato may have based his tale on fragments of much older stories, perhaps distorted memories of natural disasters, wars, or vanished cultures that ancient people vaguely recalled. The Solon connection complicates things further. Solon was not invented. He was a real political leader, respected across Greece. By tying the Atlantis narrative to him, Plato added credibility. Was this deliberate dramatic strategy, or did Plato truly believe Solon heard this story in Egypt? Historians cannot agree. Some note that Egyptian priests kept detailed records and oral histories, making it at least possible that they recounted some ancient catastrophe later retold through Plato. Critias, another character in Plato's dialogues, claims his own grandfather had passed the story down from Solon, preserving it for generations before Plato recorded it. This creates a chain of transmission that sounds almost historical, like a document being copied across time. Yet critics argue that Plato used this mechanism simply to anchor his philosophy in a believable narrative. To understand the debate, it helps to look at the broader themes Plato discussed in his works. He was deeply critical of societies driven by greed, luxury, and unchecked political ambition. He had lived through the decline of Athens, watched democracy twist into instability, and saw leaders use power irresponsibly. Atlantis, then, becomes a symbolic warning. A civilization with everything resources, knowledge, technology can still fall, not from outside enemies, but from its own internal weaknesses. Even the structure of the Atlantis story supports this reading. It contrasts two worlds, a disciplined, ideal Athens and a wealthy, decaying Atlantis. Plato does not describe Atlantis merely to excite curiosity. He uses it to shine a light on human failings. The gods do not randomly punish Atlantis. Rather, their fall serves as an example. Prosperity without virtue leads to destruction. Still, many argue that Plato's detailed descriptions are too specific to be pure invention. Why include measurements of canals? Why describe exact geological formations, metals, and climate conditions? Why speak of military organization, agriculture, and architecture so precisely? To some readers, this level of specificity suggests Plato drew upon something, whether memories of real places, rumors of vanished cultures, or second-hand tales carried down through generations. During Plato's lifetime, Greeks were aware of other civilizations beyond their borders, including Egypt and Mesopotamia, both incredibly ancient. They also heard legends of lands across the seas. Trade brought stories from distant coasts. Sailors, soldiers, and merchants told tales of storms, islands, ruins, and catastrophes. Any of these could have sparked Plato's imagination, blending inspiration with philosophy. The Egyptian reference is especially significant. Egypt was viewed by Greeks as a land of deep wisdom and old knowledge. Its priests were thought to possess records stretching farther back than Greek history. If Plato wanted to lend authority to his story, Egyptian sources would have been the perfect choice. Whether he used them as narrative devices or as authentic sources is the central mystery. Another fascinating feature is the timeline Plato gives 9,000 years before Solon. For his audience, such a number would have implied unimaginable antiquity, far beyond their own historical memory. Some modern interpreters suggest this figure may be symbolic or exaggerated, reflecting mythic scale rather than literal chronology. Others speculate that the number may have been mistranslated, corrupted, or misunderstood from Egyptian notation. Whatever the truth, Plato left the story unfinished. The dialogue Critias breaks off partway through the retelling. We never receive the complete final version. This abrupt ending has only deepened intrigue. Did Plato intend to continue but never did? Was it left incomplete deliberately, to leave the story suspended between speculation and mystery? We simply do not know. Over the centuries, readers approached Atlantis differently depending on their era. Medieval scholars largely dismissed it as allegory. Renaissance thinkers revisited it with curiosity, inspired by newfound interest in ancient texts and the exploration of unknown lands. By the time European explorers crossed the Atlantic, many wondered aloud whether they had stumbled upon the remnants of the lost island described by Plato. Suddenly, the line between philosophy and geography blurred. Yet at the core of all debates lies a fundamental truth. Plato shaped Atlantis not just as a story about a place, but about human nature. He was asking questions that reach across time. What happens to societies when they become too wealthy and comfortable? What happens when leaders lose wisdom and pursue conquest? What dangers arise when people believe they are untouchable? In that sense, Atlantis becomes less about sunken ruins and more about cultural self-examination. A warning disguised as history, a parable cloaked in geology and architecture, but because he framed it in such convincing, realistic terms, he unintentionally created an enduring puzzle. Later thinkers began asking not only, what lesson is this story teaching, but also, did this actually happen? That shift transformed Atlantis from moral metaphor into global mystery. The more we look at Plato's writings, the clearer it becomes that he knew exactly how to captivate imagination. He combined authority Egyptian priests, historical figures Solon, philosophical characters, and dramatic catastrophe. He described landscapes in vivid detail and civilizations with recognizable political structures. Whether or not he intended people to question its literal truth, the story feels grounded enough to invite investigation. Even today, researchers still debate how to classify Atlantis. Some see it as pure allegory. Others believe it was based loosely on real disasters like volcanic eruptions or lost islands. A few insist Plato preserved genuine history now buried beneath the sea. Each group interprets Plato differently because he left just enough ambiguity to prevent certainty. In this way, Plato accomplished something remarkable. He created a narrative that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It can be read as myth, as philosophy, as moral critique, as speculative history. It bridges imagination and reality so seamlessly that distinguishing between them becomes difficult. When you strip away all later embellishments, one fact remains unshakable: everything we know about Atlantis begins with Plato. There are no earlier confirmed references, no independent texts clearly describing the same place before him. Whatever else has been added across centuries, theories, maps, documentaries, modern reinterpretations, all grow from that original seed. Understanding that origin changes the question slightly. Instead of simply asking, where was Atlantis, we might also ask, what was Plato trying to make us think about? Whether he preserved fragments of a lost world or crafted an entirely symbolic tale, his message reaches forward with surprising relevance. Civilizations rise, they flourish, they become confident, and if they forget wisdom, they collapse, sometimes suddenly, sometimes by their own hand. As we continue to explore oceans, uncover ancient ruins, and develop new technology, the temptation remains to look for physical proof of Atlantis. Perhaps one day some discovery will shift the debate. But even if no evidence ever appears, the legend endures because of the truths it suggests about humanity. That endurance is itself a form of immortality. Plato may not have realized that by weaving history, imagination, and philosophy together, he would inspire thousands of years of speculation. Or perhaps he did realize it, and that was exactly his intention. Either way, the tale of Atlantis began not as adventure fiction, but as one philosopher's attempt to explain the rise and fall of societies. And from that moment forward, the lost island ceased to be just a story. It became a question, one that refuses to disappear, much like the mysterious city it describes, lingering beneath the surface of human curiosity, forever inviting us to look deeper. If the story of Atlantis begins with Plato, the great question that comes next is simple and irresistible. Could there be any real event, any real place, or any real civilization that inspired the legend? This question has driven scholars, explorers, scientists, and dreamers for centuries. They have searched maps, studied ancient texts, scanned the ocean floor, and compared geological records, hoping to find anything that might connect myth to reality. Because as extraordinary as Plato's tale sounds, history has often surprised us. Cities once thought to be pure legend like Troy eventually emerged from ruins hidden beneath layers of earth and time. So it is only natural to wonder, Could Atlantis be another example of forgotten history waiting to be uncovered? To investigate this possibility, we have to step away from imagination for a moment and enter the world of evidence, the traces civilizations leave behind. Human societies build, carve, record, and bury their lives in stone, clay, and metal. Over thousands of years, nature may damage or bury those remnants, but rarely does it erase them entirely. If Atlantis had truly been a powerful civilization, one with fleets, temples, roads, and vast cities, then somewhere, perhaps beneath the sea or hidden beneath sediment, there should be at least fragments of that world. The first theory people often consider is the most obvious. Perhaps Atlantis really did lie in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, just as Plato described. Early explorers imagined a massive continent, once stretching across the ocean, later swallowed by catastrophic forces. Old maps sometimes showed mysterious islands that no longer exist today. Sailors reported strange underwater plateaus and formations rising from the depths. These hints fed into the belief that an entire landmass might have sunk. However, modern geology challenges the idea of a lost continent in the middle of the Atlantic. Scientists now understand tectonic plates, seafloor spreading, and the formation of oceans. According to what we know, continents move over millions of years, not overnight. Land that large cannot simply sink completely beneath the ocean in a single dramatic event. If something like Atlantis had truly been a continent, its remains would still exist as significant landforms, and they do not. But dismissing a lost continent does not automatically dismiss the idea of a lost island. Islands can be destroyed, fractured, or submerged through volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis. The earth beneath us is more unstable than it appears. Whole regions have risen or fallen in geological memory. If Atlantis was smaller, an island civilization rather than a continent, then sudden destruction becomes more plausible. That possibility leads researchers to one of the most compelling real-world parallels ever discovered, the island of Thura, known today as Santorini. Thousands of years ago, Thura was home to part of the Minoan civilization, one of the most advanced cultures in the ancient world. The Minoans built elaborate palaces, created complex artwork, traded across the seas, and seemed to enjoy a flourishing society. Then, sometime around the mid-second millennium BC, disaster struck. Thura erupted. Not just any eruption, one of the most powerful volcanic explosions in human history. The blast ripped the island apart, sending ash high into the sky, darkening the atmosphere, disrupting weather patterns, and likely triggering massive tsunamis that swept across the Aegean Sea. The central part of the island collapsed into a caldera, a giant basin now filled with water. Villages were buried, harbors vanished. The shock waves may have devastated neighboring islands and coastal settlements alike. Archaeologists later uncovered preserved ruins beneath layers of ash, frozen in time, eerily reminiscent of Pompeii streets, pottery, frescoes, homes, and tools. Here was a thriving civilization suddenly interrupted. And when researchers compared Plato's story of Atlantis, an island destroyed by fire from the earth, and floods from the sea, they noticed striking similarities. A one great culture, sudden natural catastrophe. A community tied to the sea, a memory carried forward through generations. Could the Atlantis myth be a distorted retelling of the Minoan catastrophe? Many scholars believe so. They argue that Plato, hearing old stories of a disaster passed down over centuries, reshaped them into a philosophical narrative. Over time, details could have become exaggerated, distances confused, and timelines stretched. Thura did not literally sink into the deep Atlantic, but in the imagination of storytellers, an island breaking apart and vanishing could easily become a dramatic tale of a city swallowed entirely by ocean. Yet the Minoan theory does not convince everyone. Critics point out that the timeline does not fully match Plato's claim of events occurring thousands of years earlier than Greek civilization. Others suggest that while Thur explains some aspects of the story, it cannot account for everything, especially the political and moral elements Plato emphasized. They argue that Plato's Atlantis is not just about a disaster, but about arrogance, imperial ambition, and divine judgment. The Minoans, as far as we know, were traders more than conquerors. Their world does not exactly match Plato's militarized Atlantis, so researchers look elsewhere. Another theory proposes that Atlantis was not in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic at all, but in North Africa. Some point to the Sahara Desert, particularly a mysterious geological formation known as the Richat structure, a massive series of circular rings visible from space. It eerily resembles Plato's description of Atlantis' concentric city layout. Though geologists consider it a natural formation, its size and shape have fueled intense speculation. Could an ancient settlement have once existed near it, later destroyed or swallowed by shifting climates? Supporters of this idea argue that thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was green, fertile, and full of lakes and rivers. Cultures we barely understand lived there. Over millennia, environmental shifts turned lush plains into barren sand, burying anything that once stood upon them. If Atlantis were not swallowed by the sea, but instead by time and climate, perhaps its memory survived only through distorted retellings. However, skeptics respond that even if settlements existed there, they were unlikely to match the complexity and scale Plato attributed to Atlantis. Additionally, Plato clearly associated Atlantis with seafaring power, something difficult to reconcile with an inland desert today, even if it was once wetter. Then there are theories connecting Atlantis to Spain, Portugal, the Canary Islands, and even the Caribbean. Each theory highlights a particular similarity: ruins, old myths, geographic descriptions, or archaeological finds, and tries to align them with Plato's narrative. But each theory also faces contradictions. No one site matches every detail. No single discovery clearly solves the puzzle. Meanwhile, scientists caution us against jumping from coincidence to conclusion. Human imagination is powerful. When we want something to be true, we sometimes make the evidence fit our desires instead of adjusting our expectations. Yet it is equally true that archaeology continues to uncover civilizations, previously unknown societies with writing systems, trade routes, and advanced knowledge that historians did not expect. Every discovery reminds us that history is incomplete. Whole chapters of our past remain buried, misinterpreted, or erased. So dismissing Atlantis entirely feels premature to some. The world is vast, oceans are deep, our records are fragmentary. Could something significant, perhaps not identical to Plato's description but inspiring it nonetheless, still lie undiscovered? To answer that, researchers turn to another angle: memory. Human cultures pass stories down across generations, and over time, those stories evolve. A flood becomes universal. A local disaster turns mythic. A city destroyed by nature becomes a symbol of divine judgment. Oral traditions exaggerate, combine, and transform events into legends. Consider how many cultures have flood myths, tales of waters rising to drown the world, leaving only a few survivors. These stories likely reflect real, localized floods remembered across centuries and reshaped into sweeping narratives. Atlantis may function in a similar way. It could be a memory of several disasters merged together: tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes wrapped in philosophical reflection and dramatized over centuries. Plato may have woven fragments of reality into his allegory without intending people to treat every detail literally, but the human mind resists leaving mysteries unresolved. As long as there is even a faint possibility that something lies hidden beneath the waves, explorers will continue to search. Submarines, remote-controlled drones, sonar mapping, all tools have been deployed to scan the seafloor for signs of unnatural structures. Occasionally, promising formations emerge from the data, prompting excitement. Walls, roads, grid patterns. Then scientists investigate further and discover that what appeared artificial is often natural rock layers shaped by currents and erosion. Even so, each expedition adds more curiosity rather than less. We begin to realize how little of the sea has truly been explored. Entire mountain ranges lie beneath the ocean. Deep trenches descend farther than Mount Everest rises. Strange ecosystems thrive in utter darkness. If a small, technologically advanced island civilization once existed and sank in antiquity, it is not impossible that erosion, sediment, and shifting tectonics could have concealed its remains almost entirely. The deeper we go, the more Atlantis transforms from one simple question into many. Was Plato recording history, reshaping history, or inventing it? Did Atlantis resemble the Minoans, or something far older? Was it destroyed in a single dramatic event, or gradually lost over centuries? Are we searching for an actual location, or are we chasing a metaphor because we want to believe humanity once possessed wisdom now forgotten? All of these questions reveal something crucial. The legend persists not only because of archaeology, but because of what it says about human nature. Atlantis does more than promise hidden ruins. It whispers that knowledge can vanish. It warns that pride can destroy. It suggests that even great societies are fragile, dependent not only on technology and wealth, but on values they uphold. Scientists, therefore, approach Atlantis from two perspectives at once. They look for evidence, artifacts, structures, geological proof, but they also study the psychology of myths and the philosophical goals of ancient authors. In doing so, they uncover a fascinating truth. Whether Atlantis existed physically or not, it reveals real concerns of ancient civilizations, fears of natural disaster, anxiety about moral decline, awareness that power corrupts, respect for the unpredictability of nature. And every time humanity witnesses disaster in real time, whole cities flooded by tsunamis, islands swallowed by rising seas, villages buried in volcanic ash, the Atlantis story feels strangely familiar. We see echoes of it around us. The world reminds us how vulnerable we are, even at the height of our technological success. So, when modern researchers ask what actually happened to Atlantis, they are really asking two interconnected questions. First, is there a physical place lost to history that inspired Plato's tale? Second, what deeper truth about civilization was Plato communicating through his story? Perhaps the most realistic view is that Atlantis may be both rooted partly in historical memory and partly in philosophical imagination. A real disaster, like the eruption of Thura or another forgotten event, could have planted the seed. Plato then shaped that seed into something larger, symbolic, and instructive. Over time, generations forgot the original context but preserved the mystery. The legend escaped its philosophical frame and began to live a life of its own. And here we are centuries later, still chasing it, still wondering what lies beneath waves and sand. The irony is that even if one day a site is discovered matching many of Plato's details, a city destroyed in floods, arranged in complex rings, bearing signs of sudden catastrophe, debate would not end. Some would celebrate a definitive solution. Others would argue that the discovery is only one among many influences behind the myth. The story is now bigger than any single explanation. It has become a global puzzle, not because it promises treasure, but because it challenges our assumptions about knowledge, history, and ourselves. When we look across the world at the ruins of collapsed civilizations, the Maya, the Indus Valley, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, we see patterns. Prosperity, expansion, overconfidence, stress, decline, collapse, whether through warfare, environmental change, internal strife, or natural disaster, society's fall, Atlantis embodies that cycle in one dramatic image, an island vanishing in a night. That image lingers because it is universal. It tells us that permanence is an illusion, everything built can be undone, everything discovered can be forgotten. Every empire assumes it will last forever, and yet few do. The legend of Atlantis survives not because people expect to find marble temples underwater, but because it captures the fragile line between progress and destruction. It whispers that wisdom matters as much as power. And perhaps that is why every new scientist, every new explorer, every new thinker returning to Plato's words is drawn into the mystery again. We continue searching, studying, and debating, not merely to solve an archaeological question, but to understand whether Atlantis is an echo of our past or a warning about our future. For centuries, the legend of Atlantis has traveled farther than any fleet of ancient ships ever sailed. It has crossed oceans, leaped from one culture to another, and resurfaced in countless writings, maps, and explorations. Every generation seems to rediscover Atlantis, convinced that this time they have finally solved the mystery. And perhaps that is part of its power. Atlantis is not only a place in stories, but a blank canvas where people project their hopes, fears, and imaginations. Once Plato shared the tale, the world refused to let it fade. As explorers began charting new lands and sailors ventured into unknown waters, they carried Plato's description with them like a treasure map. They compared distant islands, mysterious ruins, and unusual landscapes to the philosopher's words. If they saw strange stones beneath shallow water, they whispered, "Atlantis." If they found a forgotten civilization whose knowledge seemed surprisingly advanced, they wondered, could this be it? Over time, dozens of locations were proposed as the possible site of the lost island, each backed by arguments, passion, and sometimes wishful thinking more than evidence. One of the earliest and most persistent ideas placed Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean itself, just as Plato seemed to suggest. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the ocean stretches endlessly. Early sailors imagined a vast continent hidden there, swallowed by storms and waves. When volcanic islands like the Azores were discovered, rising dramatically from the deep, they appeared mysterious enough to inspire myths. Some believed these islands were the very mountaintops of Atlantis, the last visible remains of a drowned world. Their rugged cliffs and unusual geology looked like scars, as if something catastrophic had once taken place. The theory sounded romantic. The ocean had taken a mighty kingdom as punishment, but pieces of it still poked through the surface as a reminder. Yet geologists eventually showed that the Azores sit on tectonic boundaries where volcanic activity continually reshapes the land. They were not once part of a vanished supercontinent. Instead, they formed gradually from magma deep below the Earth's crust. Still, the idea refuses to die. Even today, some explorers dive among the underwater formations near these islands and claim to see roads, walls, or pavements that might belong to Atlantis. Scientists usually counter that these shapes are natural formations caused by fractured basalt rock. But the human brain is excellent at seeing patterns where none exist. A straight line becomes a wall, a cube-like rock becomes a temple, and the legend continues. Another widespread theory places Atlantis not far from mainland Europe, but along the southern coast of Spain. In marshlands near the city of Cadiz, satellite images have revealed odd circular patterns. Some researchers argue that these shapes might match Plato's description of concentric rings of land and water in the Atlantean capital. They imagine a bustling harbor civilization, wealthy and organized, possibly connected to sea, trading cultures like the Tartessians. Archaeological digs there have uncovered ancient settlements, trade goods, and evidence that powerful communities once lived along that coastline. Supporters claim that a massive tsunami or flood may have wiped them out quickly, echoing the sudden destruction described by Plato. But again, critics caution against jumping to conclusions. The circular shapes in Spain may simply be natural geological structures or later agricultural design. There has been no definitive discovery of advanced technology, city planning, or artifacts that match the grand portrayal of Atlantis, to many professional archaeologists calling these ruins Atlantis is more marketing than science. It shows how tempting it is to turn every mystery into confirmation of a legend we desperately want to believe. Moving south, another extraordinary theory places Atlantis in a surprising location: the vast Sahara Desert. Thousands of miles from the sea, in the Mauritanian desert, lies a massive circular formation known as the Eye of the Sahara, or the Richat structure. When viewed from above, its layered rings look uncannily similar to drawings of Plato's Atlantis, a large central core surrounded by concentric circles. Some people argue that perhaps the Sahara was once fertile and lush, with rivers and lakes, and that Atlantis existed there before climate shifts turned it into sand-covered emptiness. Satellite imagery only fuels the imagination. Could the Eye of the Sahara be the eroded remains of Atlantis' great capital city? Could shifting sands have buried the evidence? Supporters emphasize that ancient maps once showed lush regions in North Africa where deserts now stand. But geologists again step in. The Richat structure is not man-made. It is a natural geological dome formed by erosion over millions of years. No artifacts of a lost super civilization have been found there. No temples, no writing systems, no roads, only stones, wind, and time. Still, curiosity persists, and expeditions continue to visit the site, hoping to prove something astonishing lies hidden beneath the sand. The Atlantic theories eventually crossed to the Americas as well. When explorers reached the New World and discovered impressive civilizations like the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas, Europeans were stunned. Here were societies with engineering genius, pyramids, astronomical knowledge, and complex social systems all developed independently. Some thinkers, unable to accept that indigenous cultures could reach such heights on their own, insisted that Atlanteans must have come to teach them. Maybe Atlantis was located somewhere in the Caribbean, they said, and its survivors spread knowledge across the Americas after their homeland sank. The Bahamas, Cuba, and other Caribbean islands became targets of speculation. Underwater ridges, sandbars, and rock formations were claimed to be the remains of lost Atlantean highways and cities. One popular site, known as the Bimini Road, consists of large stone blocks arranged in a seemingly regular pattern beneath shallow waters. Those who believe in Atlantis point to it as undeniable evidence, a submerged harbor or breakwater from a sophisticated ancient society. But marine geologists explain that these blocks are natural limestone formations that fractured along straight lines, not the work of human hands. Despite this, the story continues to attract tourists, divers, and adventure enthusiasts who long to touch the stones of a vanished world. Some theories wander even further into speculation. A few writers propose that Antarctica once housed Atlantis when it was located closer to the equator before drifting south due to continental shift. According to this idea, the continent froze over, burying an advanced society under miles of ice. Maps from the Renaissance period showing an ice-free Antarctica are sometimes cited as proof. though historians generally agree these maps were misinterpretations or creative guesses. The challenge with the Antarctic theory is simple. There is no credible archaeological evidence beneath the ice to support the existence of cities or human structures of such magnitude. And yet, the image of a frozen Atlantis, sleeping in the world's coldest wilderness, is hauntingly poetic enough for some believers to cling to. Aside from earthly explanations, Atlantis has also drifted into the realm of the supernatural and extraterrestrial. In the 19th and 20th centuries, spiritualist movements and occult writers claimed to receive messages through visions, dreams, or claimed psychic communication. They described Atlantis as a civilization with crystal power, flying machines, and mystical abilities. Others suggested Atlanteans were descendants of alien visitors who came to Earth long ago, sharing advanced knowledge before being wiped out. These ideas rarely rely on historical documents or scientific analysis. Instead, they lean on personal revelation and imaginative storytelling. They transformed Atlantis from a philosophical parable into a mythic super-civilization that borders on science fiction. Why do such theories flourish? Part of the answer lies in psychology. Humans are naturally drawn to mysteries, especially when those mysteries promise hidden wisdom or golden ages lost to time. Atlantis becomes a symbol of everything we think the ancient world might have known, but we somehow forgot. It represents the fantasy that once humans achieved extraordinary heights, perhaps greater than ours, before fate or moral failure destroyed them. Believing in Atlantis can also make the world feel more enchanted, less ordinary. Instead of accepting that knowledge developed slowly through hard work and trial and error, the legend suggests shortcuts, secret teachings, vanished technologies, cosmic connections. But there is also a more skeptical lesson hidden beneath all the speculation. Throughout history, the search for Atlantis has sometimes exposed the dangers of pseudo-archaeology, the tendency to reshape evidence to fit a myth rather than letting facts speak first. When researchers start with the conclusion, Atlantis must be real, and then try to force every strange ruin or formation to match it, they risk distorting both science and history. Many legitimate ancient cultures end up overshadowed by the myth. Instead of appreciating the incredible achievements of real societies like the Minoans, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Mayans, some storytellers claim that all of their knowledge came from Atlantis. This unintentionally steals credit from the people who actually built those civilizations. Still, the allure persists even among serious scholars. They don't necessarily believe in a super-advanced lost world, but they acknowledge that legends often preserve kernels of truth. Perhaps the story of Atlantis reflects memories of real disasters, floods, quakes, tsunamis, and eruptions that destroyed communities unexpectedly. Ancient people would have passed down those experiences orally, exaggerating or dramatizing over generations. By the time the tales reached Plato, they might have transformed from a tragic historical event into an epic story about divine punishment and moral decline. So while the literal Atlantis may not exist, the emotions behind the legend, fear of collapse, admiration of greatness, grief over loss, certainly do. In modern times, technology has joined the search. Sonar scanning, underwater drones, and satellite imagery allow scientists to map the seafloor with extraordinary detail. Occasionally, they discover structures from sunken ports, towns submerged by earthquakes, or even entire landscapes lost when sea levels rose after the last ice age. These real underwater discoveries often reignite conversations about Atlantis. If whole cities can sink into lakes or coastlines, why not believe an entire island civilization disappeared as well? Each new underwater finding becomes fuel for debate, even when it has nothing to do with Plato's writings. On documentaries, blogs, and social media, Atlantis thrives more than ever. Some creators present speculative ideas as if they were proven fact, using dramatic visuals and selective information to convince viewers. Others carefully analyze the legend, balancing curiosity with caution. The internet has allowed both serious researchers and enthusiastic dreamers to share their theories freely. As a result, Atlantis has shifted from an academic curiosity into a cultural phenomenon, a story reinvented thousands of times across books, films, games, and videos. Despite all of this, one observation remains constant. The more theories appear, the clearer it becomes that no single explanation fully satisfies everyone. Every proposed location has strengths and weaknesses. The Azores show volcanic drama, but little archaeology. Spain presents archaeological traces, but lacks proof of extraordinary technology. The Sahara Eye matches visual descriptions, yet is undeniably natural. The Caribbean holds mysterious formations that science mostly explains as geology. Antarctica intrigues imaginations but freezes under scrutiny, and supernatural theories drift even further from verifiable reality. Yet perhaps the most fascinating thing about the search is not whether Atlantis existed, but what the relentless desire to find it says about us. We seem to long for lost paradises, for stories of civilizations that once lived in harmony, possessed deep wisdom, and fell because of human flaws. Atlantis embodies both inspiration and warning, a symbol of what humanity might achieve and what it could lose. When people debate its location, they are often really debating human nature, destiny, and the fragility of society. So Atlantis travels through time, shifting with every era. In the age of exploration, it was a hidden continent awaiting discovery. In the industrial age, it became an advanced technological society. In the modern spiritual age, it morphed into a mystical realm of crystals and cosmic beings. And in the digital age, it is a global conversation, constantly revived by new voices asking the same ancient question: what if the story is true? Scientists may insist on caution, and rightly so. Without physical, verifiable evidence, Atlantis remains unproven. Archaeology works best when it finds artifacts, inscriptions, buildings, and datable remains, not just attractive coincidences. But even scientists acknowledge that Earth's oceans still hold many secrets. We have explored less of the deep sea than we have explored the moon. Entire sections of the seafloor remain unmapped. It is possible that there are ruins out there we have not yet seen. Maybe not of Plato's Atlantis, but of lesser, known coastal settlements swallowed by rising waters over thousands of years, and so the legend lives on, balanced between skepticism and wonder. With every new discovery, every submerged wall, every ancient shipwreck, every hint of a forgotten culture, someone, somewhere, whispers the same hopeful thought: maybe this is it. Even when evidence later disproves the claim, the excitement never fully fades. The next discovery might be different. The next expedition might uncover something extraordinary. In the end, Atlantis has become more than a geographical puzzle. It is a story that keeps humanity thinking, imagining, questioning, and exploring. It reminds us that civilizations, no matter how grand, are vulnerable to forces beyond their control, whether natural disasters or their own mistakes, and it challenges us to ask, if a great society once vanished, what lessons should we learn from it so history does not repeat itself? Whether Atlantis existed as Plato described it, or whether it was simply a brilliantly constructed allegory, it continues to cast its shadow across oceans and deserts, maps and minds, not because we have found it, but because we still want to. And in that sense, the legend of Atlantis may never truly sink. It remains forever floating, not in the waters of the Atlantic, but in the imagination of all who hear its story. When people first hear the story of Atlantis, they often focus on the spectacular details: the shining temples, the grand navy, the incredible technology, and, of course, the dramatic moment when the entire civilization disappears beneath the sea. But if we pause for a moment and look deeper, something more powerful appears beneath the surface of the legend. Atlantis is not just a story about a lost island, it is also a story about human nature, about ambition, pride, wisdom, and collapse. It raises questions that echo across centuries. What makes a civilization great? What makes it fall? And could the same thing happen again? Plato, the philosopher who first recorded the tale, was not simply trying to entertain his readers. His writings were filled with debates about how societies should be governed, how people should live, and why justice matters. When he described Atlantis, he painted it as a place blessed with natural resources, brilliant architecture, and powerful rulers. It had everything a society could possibly want, and yet it destroyed itself. The message hidden within the myth is haunting. Greatness alone is not enough to guarantee survival. According to the story, the people of Atlantis began as noble and disciplined. Their leaders were guided by wisdom and virtue. Over time, however, wealth, luxury, and power seeped into their hearts like poison. They became greedy, unfair, and hungry for domination. They stopped thinking about what was right and instead focused only on what they could conquer. In Plato's narrative, this moral decay mattered more than any earthquake or tsunami. Nature may have finished Atlantis, but human behavior had already cracked its foundations. This theme resonates because history provides countless real-world examples. Great empires have risen powerful, confident, and seemingly unstoppable, only to collapse from corruption, internal conflict, or arrogance. Rome expanded across continents and then weakened from political chaos. Powerful kingdoms in Mesopotamia and Egypt experienced prosperity followed by decline. Even modern nations have faced moments where pride and greed pushed them toward destruction. Atlantis becomes a symbolic reminder that no society, no matter how advanced, is immune to failure. At a deeper level, Atlantis also speaks to our personal lives. Every individual, like every civilization, faces temptations of ego and excess. The legend asks quietly, what happens when success blinds us? When comfort makes us careless? When our desire to control everything becomes our biggest weakness? Plato used the city not only as a political example, but as a mirror that reflects human tendencies. In that sense, Atlantis is less about geography and more about psychology. Another powerful dimension of the myth is the idea of lost knowledge. Many people imagine Atlantis as a place where extraordinary science and wisdom once existed, secrets about energy, healing, or technology that we no longer possess. Even when there is little evidence for such ideas, the fascination remains. Deep down, human beings often feel that something has slipped away from us, that perhaps we once understood the world differently, more harmoniously, and then somehow lost that connection. Atlantis becomes a symbol of that missing piece, the golden age that vanished too soon. But this longing for lost wisdom is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it inspires curiosity, research, and storytelling. On the other, it can create unrealistic fantasies about the past. Many people begin to believe that ancient cultures could only have achieved greatness with help from mythical Atlanteans or mysterious forces. This viewpoint unintentionally underestimates real historical peoples, whose achievements were built through creativity, perseverance, and intelligence. The pyramids, the aqueducts, the temples, the astronomy, all of these wonders were created by humans using knowledge available in their own time. The myth of Atlantis should inspire us, but it should not erase the accomplishments of real civilizations. Still, there is something undeniably powerful in the image of a society vanishing overnight. It reminds us that stability is fragile. Natural disasters, environmental changes, and political missteps can transform thriving communities into ruins. Plato's Atlantis may have been imaginary, but disasters like the volcanic eruption at Santorini, the destruction of Pompeii, or the great floods of antiquity were real. People truly did watch their worlds crumble in moments. Atlantis compresses all of those tragedies into one unforgettable story, reminding us that arrogance toward nature can be deadly. The legend also challenges how we measure success. Atlantis had riches, fleets, and armies. But according to Plato, it lacked something more important: humility and balance. In many ways, the myth questions material obsession. It suggests that societies built purely on greed and expansion eventually collapse under their own weight. That lesson remains strikingly relevant today, as modern nations grapple with environmental crises, inequality, and uncontrolled consumption. Sometimes it feels as though Atlantis is not just a warning from the past, but a prophecy about the future. Beyond warnings and philosophy, Atlantis also satisfies a deep emotional longing in humanity, the desire for mystery. We live in an age where satellites map the globe, science explains natural forces, and information flows faster than ever. Yet the idea that somewhere beneath the ocean lies a forgotten world full of secrets that thought ignites imagination like few others. The unknown calls to us, and Atlantis gives shape to that call. It reminds us that there are still stories untold and depths unexplored. It reassures us that wonder has not completely vanished from the world. For storytellers, filmmakers, and writers, Atlantis has become a canvas. Some portray it as a utopia filled with advanced technology and peace. Others depict it as a corrupt empire destroyed by its own cruelty. Each retelling reshapes the myth to reflect the fears and hopes of its era. In times of war, Atlantis becomes a warning about aggression. In times of scientific discovery, it becomes a metaphor for human potential. In times of environmental concern, it becomes an example of civilizations ignoring nature's limits. The legend survives precisely because it adapts. Children hearing the tale for the first time may think only of underwater palaces and lost treasures. Adults, hearing it again years later, begin to notice the deeper messages hidden between the lines. Few myths grow with us the way Atlantis does. It can be entertainment, philosophy, morality, and mystery all at once, and that layered quality is rare. Another fascinating aspect is the tension between hope and loss. Atlantis represents a world that was once magnificent, a place where things might have been better, brighter, more advanced. But it is also a reminder that even the most beautiful worlds can fall apart. Humans constantly balance these two emotions, nostalgia for what could have been and anxiety about what could be lost. In this balance, Atlantis feels real not because archaeologists have found it, but because emotionally we recognize it. There is also a subtle political message in Plato's story. Atlantis, in his writings, stood in contrast to Athens, which he described as more modest, disciplined, and morally grounded. Atlantis was rich but corrupted. Athens was poorer but principled. Whether or not this comparison was historically fair, it reveals Plato's belief that character matters more than luxury or size. A small, just society may outlast a mighty one built on greed. This idea challenges the modern obsession with power, territory, and dominance, reminding us that moral strength can be more enduring than military force. At the same time, the myth raises questions about divine justice and fate. In the story, Atlantis' downfall is not random. It happens as a response to its moral decline. In ancient philosophy, this theme appears often. When individuals or civilizations grow too arrogant, the universe or the gods eventually respond. Whether one interprets this literally or metaphorically, the message remains powerful. Actions have consequences, even if those consequences arrive slowly or unexpectedly. For many people, the meaning of Atlantis also lies in its uncertainty. Because we do not know for sure whether it existed, we are forced to think critically about evidence, belief, and myth. The story encourages skepticism while still leaving space for wonder. It teaches that curiosity is valuable, but it must be balanced with reason. Without that balance, imagination can drift into fantasy disguised as truth. With it, legends like Atlantis can inspire research, exploration, and deeper thought, rather than deception or false claims. Perhaps one of the most moving interpretations of Atlantis is that it symbolizes memory itself. Memories fade, change, warp, and sometimes disappear entirely. A civilization may leave behind ruins, but eventually even those erode. The idea that a whole society could be forgotten by history mirrors the way human stories vanish over time. Atlantis becomes a poetic representation of all the cultures we no longer remember, the countless villages, languages, and traditions that vanished without a trace. When we speak of Atlantis, we are also mourning everything humanity has lost to time, and yet there is hope hidden in that mourning. The search for Atlantis drives exploration. It encourages oceanic research, archaeology, and scientific curiosity. Some expeditions may begin with myth, but they end with genuine discoveries about our planet's past: submerged towns, ancient shorelines, forgotten settlements. Even if Atlantis is never found, the journey to look for it reveals important truths about human history. In this way, the legend becomes a tool rather than an obstacle. Atlantis also invites people to reflect on their own societies today. Are we repeating the mistakes of that mythical civilization? Are we becoming too obsessed with wealth and expansion, ignoring moral and environmental warnings? Are we treating power as the ultimate goal instead of wisdom? These are not questions about the past, they are questions about the present. That is why teachers, philosophers, and thinkers continue to discuss the myth. It remains an ethical mirror, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. Some people interpret Atlantis as a metaphor for technological overconfidence. The society in the story appears advanced, comfortable, and secure until it is not. Modern civilizations with satellites, skyscrapers, and digital networks sometimes forget how fragile they are. A single disaster, economic collapse, or global crisis can expose weaknesses hidden beneath the surface. Atlantis whispers, "Do not assume you are untouchable." It reminds us that humility, preparation, and wisdom are as important as innovation. Others see Atlantis as an expression of human resilience. Even though the city vanished, the story survived. It traveled through time, preserved in conversation and literature. In that sense, Atlantis did not completely disappear, it transformed into a lesson. Cultures may fall, but knowledge can endure if it is shared. The myth encourages us to record history, preserve stories, and learn from them instead of allowing them to fade. There is also a deeply emotional human element. Many people experience personal Atlantis moments. In their lives, times when something they thought was permanent suddenly collapses: relationships, careers, beliefs, or plans. The legend offers a metaphor for those experiences. It teaches that loss, though painful, can carry insight. From destruction, reflection often emerges. From reflection, new understanding grows. That is why some people feel strangely comforted by the story rather than only frightened. Even the debate about Atlantis reality has meaning. Some argue passionately that it existed, others argue that it did not. Their disagreement reveals how powerful stories can become. A tale created thousands of years ago still has the ability to inspire research, arguments, films, and books. It shapes conversations about archaeology, morality, politics, and faith. Few legends have that kind of lasting force. In that sense, whether Atlantis physically existed matters less than the cultural impact it left behind. Ultimately, the meaning of Atlantis cannot be reduced to just one lesson. It is many things at once: a cautionary tale, a philosophical reflection, a dream of lost paradise, a spark for scientific curiosity, and a reminder of human vulnerability. Its layers unfold differently depending on who hears it and when. For a philosopher, it is a study of justice. For a historian, it is a mystery. For a storyteller, it is an endless source of inspiration. For ordinary listeners, it is a haunting reminder that greatness and fragility often walk side by side. And perhaps this complexity is exactly why the myth has survived, while so many others have faded. Atlantis feels real not because of evidence, but because it speaks directly to universal truths. We all fear losing what we love. We all wonder whether our societies will endure. We all long for a world better than our own. Atlantis holds all of these emotions together inside one unforgettable image: a grand city rising from the sea, shining for a moment in history, and then slipping beneath the waves. In the end, when people ask, "What does Atlantis truly mean?" the most honest answer may be that it means whatever lesson humanity needs at the moment. It is a story that adapts to our concerns and mirrors our inner struggles. It warns us against arrogance, invites us to respect nature, reminds us to value wisdom over wealth, and challenges us to learn from the past while still dreaming about the future. That is why, even if Atlantis never existed as a physical place, it remains one of the most enduring places ever imagined, a lost world that continues to shape the living one. For thousands of years, Atlantis has lingered in the human imagination like a ghost that refuses to fade. It has become more than a place. It is a mirror reflecting our fears, our ambitions, and our deepest curiosity about what lies beneath the surface of history. And as we step into the modern world, equipped with science, technology, satellites, submarines, and data that Plato could never have dreamed of, the question still remains: what actually happened to Atlantis? Or perhaps more precisely, why do we keep searching? The story of Atlantis did not die in antiquity. Instead, it resurfaced again and again, morphing to fit each era's obsessions. During the Renaissance, scholars and explorers looked at Plato's account and saw opportunity. They believed lost lands might still be waiting to be discovered, perhaps containing knowledge, treasure, or proof of biblical floods. European explorers arriving in the Americas sometimes wondered whether the civilizations they encountered, rich in architecture, astronomy, and engineering, might somehow be connected to Atlantis. Later, the Victorians imagined Atlantis as a cradle of mystical wisdom, a kind of forgotten super-civilization that seeded all others. Writers, occultists, and early pseudo-scientists loved the idea because it solved too many mysteries at once. If something was impressive, ancient, or unexplained, Atlantis could be invoked as its origin. But in the scientific age, the story evolved again. Instead of mystical continents supported by myth, new underwater discoveries revealed something far more grounded yet still astonishing. Geologists learned just how unstable Earth's crust can be. They discovered evidence of massive volcanic eruptions, sudden tectonic shifts, violent tsunamis, and entire coastlines swallowed by the sea. Archaeologists uncovered ancient cities buried by disaster, Pompeii encased in ash, Akrotiri frozen in time, Doggerland drowned beneath the North Sea, and settlements submerged off the coasts of Greece, India, and Japan. These discoveries didn't prove Atlantis, but they showed that whole worlds truly can vanish. And suddenly, Plato's warning didn't feel like fantasy anymore. It felt like history wearing the mask of allegory. Yet modern science forces us to ask harder questions. Plato was explicit. Atlantis was meant as a moral lesson. A society rises to greatness, grows arrogant, loses its way, and collapses. It is a cautionary tale about power, greed, and forgetting the principles that sustain civilization. So why, then, do so many people desperately want Atlantis to be a literal place? Maybe it is because human beings crave origins. We want to believe there was once a golden age, a moment when humanity possessed incredible knowledge, harmony, or technology, before tragedy wiped it all out. A lost paradise suggests that we aren't just progressing forward, we are also trying to regain something. However, there is another, more uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps Atlantis captivates us because we see ourselves in its downfall. We live in a world where superpowers rise and fall, where environmental crises worsen, where technology advances faster than wisdom. Plato's description of Atlantis sounds eerily modern, a wealthy empire driven by expansion, obsessed with luxury, confident that nothing could ever touch it until nature and fate delivered an unexpected blow. To read Atlantis is to read a warning label on human civilization itself. And so, researchers continue to search, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly. Marine archaeologists map the seafloor using sonar and robot submersibles. Satellite imagery reveals faint shapes buried beneath silt and sand. Universities examine volcanic cores, sediment layers, and ancient tsunami deposits. They look at the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of the Minoans, and the destruction of coastal settlements, piecing together how disasters ripple through societies. Each discovery adds context, but never complete certainty. Meanwhile, outside academia, the myth grows wilder. YouTube videos claim alien cities lie underwater. Books insist that Atlanteans had aircraft, crystal power, or supernatural abilities. Television turns speculation into spectacle because mystery sells. None of those ideas have credible evidence, but they persist because they offer something irresistible, an extraordinary secret supposedly hidden from the world. That tension between rigorous investigation and sensational fantasy is part of what makes Atlantis so fascinating. It invites everyone to participate. Scientists see a puzzle, storytellers see a legend, dreamers see possibility, and even skeptics are drawn in, because debunking Atlantis is often as engaging as believing in it. But here is where the story becomes truly interesting. Sometimes myths turn out to preserve fragments of truth, not literal descriptions, but emotional memories. Generations who survived floods, quakes, and fires passed down their trauma through stories. Over centuries, storytellers added symbolism, heroes, and moral lessons. When Plato retold Atlantis, he may have woven together real human experiences, natural disasters, collapsing cities, moral decay into a single dramatic narrative. The lost continent becomes less important than the message behind it, and yet, every few years, a new discovery reignites the debate. A strange structure is found underwater. An unusual island formation appears suspicious. A researcher proposes a new location: Santorini, Spain, Morocco, Antarctica, the Caribbean, the Azores. The list keeps growing. Some ideas are grounded in evidence, others are pure fantasy. But each time, headlines explode. Scientists may have found Atlantis. And every time, the truth is more subtle, more complex, and far more human. Perhaps the real question is not whether Atlantis existed, but whether its fate is still unfolding right now. Consider the warnings embedded in the story: pride, exploitation of nature, inequality, political corruption, environmental disaster. These themes aren't ancient relics, they are headlines. Atlantis is not only about a city sinking beneath the sea, It is about civilizations collapsing from within long before the water ever rises. Floods may be natural, arrogance is chosen. Imagine archaeologists thousands of years from now discovering the ruins of our own world. They would find evidence of advanced technology, sprawling cities, and astonishing achievements, but also pollution, conflict, and sudden environmental crises. If future storytellers crafted a myth about us, would it sound any less dramatic than Atlantis? Or would we become someone else's lost civilization, spoken of with wonder and regret? And that is the quiet, haunting genius of Plato's tale. It refuses to give closure. Atlantis is neither fully true nor fully false. It is a warning dressed as history and history disguised as myth. It reminds us that greatness is fragile. It shows how quickly nature can reclaim what empires take for granted. It suggests that no society, no matter how powerful, is immune to collapse when it loses balance. Still, the ocean has its secrets. Human curiosity will not stop at cautionary tales. There are trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall. There are underwater cave systems unexplored, shipwrecks buried, and ancient coastlines hidden beneath layers of mud. Each discovery reveals that we know far less about our planet than we imagine. About 70% of Earth's surface is ocean, and most of it remains unmapped in detail. Within that mystery, the idea of Atlantis feels almost plausible, or at least possible enough to keep us searching. At the same time, searching itself carries responsibility. History teaches us that when myths are misused, they can justify dangerous ideas, from racial superiority theories to fabricated ancient histories that rewrite truth for political purposes. Atlantis has been abused in exactly these ways before. That is why credible researchers emphasize evidence, skepticism, and ethical interpretation. Myths should inspire exploration, not distort reality. Yet myths also shape culture in positive ways. Artists paint imaginary Atlantean cities, writers build entire fantasy worlds, filmmakers create breathtaking underwater kingdoms. Children learn to ask questions about the past. Viewers of history channels like yours explore documentaries, debates, and archaeological expeditions. Atlantis serves as a doorway into learning. You enter seeking a sunken continent, and you leave understanding geology, philosophy, history, and human psychology. So what actually happened to Atlantis? The most honest answer is layered. On one level, Atlantis was likely Plato's fictional tool, an allegory inspired by real disasters, possibly influenced by places like the Minoan world. On another level, Atlantis happened, again and again throughout history, wherever cities rose, ignored warnings, and fell to catastrophe. And on the deepest level, Atlantis continues to happen inside the human mind as long as we remain fascinated by lost worlds, fragile civilizations, and mysteries beneath the sea. But the story does not end with certainty. It ends with invitation, an invitation to question, to explore, to remain humble, and to recognize the fragile balance between human ambition and the planet that sustains it. Atlantis reminds us that memory and imagination are powerful forces capable of preserving warnings across thousands of years. It tells us that the ocean keeps secrets, but also that every secret carries a lesson. And so, as we close this journey through myth and history, one truth lingers like the tide. Atlantis may or may not have been real, but the danger it warns about absolutely is. Civilizations fall when they forget what made them strong: wisdom, balance, respect for nature, and awareness of their own limits. Whether buried beneath waves or preserved in books, that warning survives. Perhaps that, in the end, is the true legacy of Atlantis. It is not a lost continent waiting to be discovered. It is a story waiting to be understood. And as long as human beings continue to dream, question, and search the depths both of the ocean and of their own history, Atlantis will never fully sink. It will remain there, just below the surface of our imagination, reminding us that every great society must choose between humility and hubris, between learning from the past and repeating it, and the final outcome, just like the lost city itself, will depend on whether we heed the warning or ignore it until the waves rise again